Hi, I'm Aldo. Welcome to Plays the Thing, the channel where I share my experiences prepping and playing tabletop role playing games. This episode is the first report for the ShadowDark game that I started not long ago. ShadowDark, of course, is the dark fantasy role playing game written by Kelsey Dion and published through her company, Arcane Library. It's a great little game, and we're having fun playing it. So, the last video I created or I talked about the characters that we made, and I talked a little bit about the setting, which is the Gloaming, published in Kelsey's First Scrolls #1, and I gave you a little bit of the setup. Today we're going to jump into what actually happened when we started playing. So let me transition over to the forge here, where I have, hang on a second, where I have just the region map. Let's see. All right, there we go. So this is the region map. Remember, the characters are, and this is a modified version of the region map. I've taken out all of the stuff that the players know nothing about. Um, so they are based here where I'm pinging. I think you can see that on the screen. Yeah. Where I'm pinging is Wardenwood. And over here is Marin's Hold, which is a fishing village. Wardenwood, as I mentioned last time, is primarily lumberers and hunters that make their living off of the land. And the characters all have ties to Wardenwood, which you can review the setup video to get a handle on what those were. So okay, so when we started play, we did what you do um, in ShadowDark, which is that you roll initiative. In ShadowDark, you're rolling initiative all the time as a way of kind of structuring the order in which characters take actions, be they combat or non-combat actions. And so I did that. The characters all rolled their initiatives, and we began play. Now, just before that, I presented the players with a situation, and the situation was this: that they had all of their relationships to Wardenwood, all of their standing, already stated um, relationships to the village and their circumstances for being there. But I said, in addition, for the last several weeks, there has been a strange illness that has made its way into Wardenwood, and there are 5 people in town now that are sick and getting worse, moving towards death. Right. And one of the characters, that one of the non-player characters that is ill, is a man by the name of Carlin, who is the proprietor, the owner of and proprietor of Mead's Hearth, which serves as an inn and tavern, but really is kind of a community center for everybody in Wardenwood. His wife Ilana is also one of the proprietors there, and she and her 3 children are running the place now. But the husband has taken ill, and so he is upstairs and not doing well. So I presented that as just a circumstance that was at play, a situation that is at play in Wardenwood, and when expecting the characters, or at least inviting the characters to take some sort of position relative to that circumstance as we went through initiative order. So the first character to win initiative was, and I'm going to ping on her down here. This is Rowena. She is my wife's character, Lauren's character. And Rowena is, if we look at her right here, she is a human witch who is woodborne as a background. Okay, and we've already established that she's basically served. She's a young woman, but but she basically serves as the town's healer. Now she doesn't have herbalism or anything like that, but we decided that her woodborne background, where she was basically found in the hollow of a tree, right, and that is not explained except that she was taken in by a, a same-sex couple and raised as their child in the community. And there are all these kind of like mystical interpretations of the circumstances of finding her. So we decided that she has an affinity for the wood, at least those portions of the wood that have not been tainted by demonic presence, which are few and far between, or subsumed between, under the broader, very dark, very infernal kind of presence. But that she represents something of a healthier forest, and that she consequently has um, some affinity for the kind of remedies and things that could help her to serve as a healer. She's kind of like just a more intuitive healer, right? Um, so in that role, Lauren said that she would have been doing several things in the last several weeks, and then something very specific in the moment where we started play. And we started play, by the way, um, in the evening, as the men, the hunters, and the lumberers had returned from their work and were gathered in Gede's hearth. And Ilana and her three kids were very busy trying to keep their spirits up while their beloved husband and father was upstairs ill and overworked as they were trying to kind of keep things together, right? And so that was the moment. And in the moment, Rowena was upstairs with Carlin, who's lying sick in bed, trying to tend for him, to care for him in particular. But Lauren also said that over the last several weeks, she would have been doing two things. One, trying to use her woodborne background to see if there was anything that she could do to um, slow down the progression of the illness, if not cure it altogether. And two, in talking to the men to see if she could figure out some sort of pattern as to how this manifested, or why this manifested, or the way it manifested, some sort of clue as to what would have bound everything together, right? So I had her make a couple of rolls for those investigations and those efforts. We rolled poorly on the healing roll. And normally, if she were just doing healing, I wouldn't have her make a roll. If she were just being kind of like an herbalist, kind of like just passing out remedies, I wouldn't have to make her roll. But she's against something here that is of consequence. So I said, okay, if there's a chance of mitigating it, a roll is probably required. And then also, she's not an investigator by any stretch. So I wanted to make an intelligence roll to see if she was able to do anything with that. And she failed at both rolls. So I did tell her that she was able to make the people more comfortable while going through the illness, but she was not able to slow down the illness at all. So the things were getting worse for the people in Wardenwood. And then I told her that unfortunately she had not been able to find any patterns that would give her a clue as to what was causing this. So she was doing her best, but her best was not yet making a difference, much to her dismay. Right. So the second person to make their initiative roll was Bernard. Bernard is a knight of Saint Idris, a human knight of Saint Idris, and a cult initiate by background. And we had decided, or Dan had decided, Dan is this player, Bernard's player. Dan had decided that he knows that the Knights of Saint Idris are kind of scary, and so he is a devout knight of Saint Idris, which means, by the way, that he is a cursed knight. He's taken in some of the infernal aspect of the wood to fight the infernal aspect of the wood. Um, but that he passes himself off as a knight errant from the north who's come down here to help. And so when I asked him, well, what are you doing? He said, he's come into the village. He's always passed through the village, right? He has a history with Wardenwood for the last couple of years at least, but he makes his way through. And this day, when he comes into the village and he sees Ilana and her three children kind of burdened the way they are, trying to keep the community alive by maintaining the community center, that he basically doffs his weapons and his armor, puts on an apron, and gets busy helping out, sweeping, cleaning, um, and just otherwise being a support to Alana. And Dan just played it off really well, right? It was I don't know, it was a very heartwarming kind of like expression of humility and community, right? And knowing, of course, that he's a demon knight and that he has that, or he's a knight who flirts with infernal powers. Um, it's interesting seeing him in this very human and very community oriented aspect. So, and of course, Ilana is just very grateful and very humbled and very much enthusiastic about what Bernard represents and the children too and all of that. So that's what Dan was doing, or what Bernard was doing. We then move to a couple of other characters here. Wraith, who is by background, he's a warlock, but by background, he is marked. And his player, Andrew, told me that Craith basically makes his living by going from Wardenwood to Marin's Hold and back again. Although he lives in Wardenwood primarily, his he makes a living by ferrying merchants from one village to the other. But he said, given the current situation where there's this illness, he's suspended his movements to and from the city so as to not get anybody ill if he should be a carrier, right? So he's been more hanging out in Wardenwood, and this night just found him in the tavern, having a meal and not doing anything particularly related to figuring out what this illness was. It's not his role. It's not the type of thing he's used to. But it was interesting to see him say, but I am going to forego my regular patterns because of the illness. And then also there, and not really particularly mindful of the illness or anything, is Ursula. Ursula is a orc fighter who is a ranger by background. And we know that the only other community that I have on here is the orc community that's in the swamps south of this region on the map. And she's from there, but she's been in Wardenwood for a couple of years, as we said in the setup video. And she is she found herself in the tavern this night, basically eating like a pig with he's playing to Ursula's 3 charisma. Mike, her player, was playing to Ursula's 3 charisma by saying, she eats like a pig. She has bad habits. Nobody really likes to hang around her so much, but they respect her for being a good axe hand, right? And so she was there just basically doing that. And then we come to Renwick, who's played by my friend Jason. And Renwick is a human wizard, who is a cult initiate to the cult of Ord, who is the god of knowledge, magic, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And he said that what he had been doing for the last couple of weeks, or especially in the last yeah, for the last couple of weeks in response to the illness, is that he's been basically um conducting experiments, barging into people's homes and asking them questions without much good graces, because he has kind of a low charisma. He also is very arrogant. He thinks he's the smartest person that he knows. And so he's not particularly, he's kind of dismissive of other people around him. But he's very goal oriented and tries to solve problems. And one of the things that he's trying to solve is a problem, this illness. So I had to make a roll to see if he'd been able to figure out what he was interested in. One, is this a natural illness, or is it magical in some way, or is it poison in some way, or something like that? And two, um, can he, like Rowena was trying to do, can he figure out any patterns? So for the first, he was definitely able to determine, after some experimentation that he conducted after a week of gathering samples and asking questions and stuff like that and checking out symptoms, he was able to determine that it was indeed an infernal poison, essentially, that was causing this disease, right? That it was some sort of poison that had infernal magic or presence kind of laced into it. And so he was able to kind of identify what it was, didn't have what it took to make an antidote for it, but he was able to determine that it was of that nature. But he was not able to discover any patterns, right? Anything that could tell him how this came about, except that they live kind of in a demon forest. So maybe it's just something that has to do with the forest itself, right? So that's what he was doing. And then we go to the last member of the player character bunch, which is Asher. Asher is a human warlock who has a wizard spell, because that's what he rolled as part of his boon. And he's a sacrifice as background, right? He was raised by witches to be sacrificed but escaped that fate, and now he lives here in Wardenwood. And he's like, "Look, I'm not in the tavern because one, I have a 4 charisma, and I'm not social, and I'm a recluse, and I'm introverted, and all of that. So I am not in the tavern. And in part, I also don't want this disease, right? So I'm isolating myself from people." And so he told me, "Well, I have a little hut, sits close to the gates to the village, because the village is surrounded by a wooden palisade and they have gates that they close every night." And he says, "I have a little hut that's right near there." I'm like, "All right, interesting." So I told him, "You hear the guards, the gate's already closed for the night, but you hear the guards speaking with somebody." And they were speaking to an old woman. An old woman was asking to be able to be let in to the Wardenwood. And I made a reaction roll for the guard to see if they would cave to the woman's request, or give in to the woman's request. And they said, "No, I'm sorry, old woman." Asher heard them say, "I'm sorry, old woman, but we do not open the gates for anybody once they are closed for the night. You'll have to fend for yourself and maybe try again in the morning." Right? Pretty harsh to tell an old woman that. Asher basically just like shrugged his shoulders and just went about his night, which is totally cool, right? So, with that, we went through that initiative order. And by the way, let me say that I really like this initiative order. One of the things that people will say about ShadowDark is that they don't like the way that you roll initiative and go in this very kind of like uh ordered, this very kind of potentially stilted kind of order of play. I find that it's great because it helps me to, and everybody understands that the spotlight moves in that way. And that means that, players who are very enthusiastic or very vocal or very, "I want to do this and then I want to do this and I will do this," there's less chance of them being able to kind of run away with a narrative and steal attention from other people. Now, as a GM, of course, when I'm playing games that don't do this, I try to move that spotlight along anyway. But there's just something about having it be in the rules and kind of communicated with everybody to everybody that makes that um better. I find it that it makes it better. The one tweak that I've made, and if you listen to Kelsey talk about this, she intends, I think, for it to be kind of loose, right? Um, but I've made an official tweak to that, and that's what I'm saying. I say, like, if a player says they have initiative and they say, "I'm planning on doing this, whatever this is," and there's another player later in that initiative that was going to go do the same thing, but the players have permission to say, "Oh, I also was going to do that. Does it make sense for me to go with them?" And if the circumstances are right, like they're both in the same room when that action is being taken, and it makes sense for as one character walks in that direction for the other one just to follow, then we don't have a problem with them bundling their initiatives and moving on and doing that thing, and we resolve that together and then maintain the initiative for everybody else, right? They just use their initiative earlier. So that's the one tweak that we've made so far. And I don't know, I find that it works well. So that's something that I really appreciate. Once we move through that first initiative round, right, which was really, again, we're not in combat, we're not in exploration mode or anything like that, but it was like, "What are you doing this evening?" Right? We said, "Okay." Um, I tried to like brush through, like, "Okay, you guys all go to sleep and wake up the next morning." But the players kind of asked for another initiative round, a kind of like a messier initiative round where they got to tell me what their going to bed rituals were like. Some of them had very specific things they wanted to do, or really just for flavor, or for portraying their characters in a particular way. I think it was Asher said that he would be burning wormwood before he be passed out for the night. I think that Renwick said something about like how he was in his treehouse, because Renwick has a treehouse within the palisade that he was up there doing something before he turned in, and there were a few things like that. But they asked for like another round of like just like what are we doing this evening as we go to bed descriptions, and then we came into the next morning, and then we took the same initiative and went through. Now, I am not going to walk you through everybody's initiative the way that I just did for this. but do understand that we went in that order. Instead, I'm just going to kind of tell you how things went that morning. So many of the characters, half of them, I'll tell you right now: Kraith, Asher, and Ursula. Right. So Kraith, Asher, and Ursula. I'm going to move them and group them in that way. In fact, I'll group Asher and Kraith together and Ursula apart. All three of those characters went to the gates in the morning because they were waiting for the men to gather their meals for the day, which they would then take out into the wood with them. Right, the hunters would pack like a traveling lunch, and the lumberers would pack lunch sacks as well that they would take out to their work sites, and that's something that apparently happens every day in Wardenwood when everybody kind of gathers, and Alana and her kids, and in this case actually also still Bernard would kind of help with that kind of service, right? And these three, right, are serving as guards for those groups. So they were waiting by the gate for the people to come out and go out into the wood, and they did just that. Asher and Kraith, I put them together because they decided to go out with the hunters that day. So they were going to be out in the wood, just protecting the hunters from anything that comes out of the wood. And Ursula said that she was going to go with the lumberers that day. So that's what they did, and they did that, right. As the people started coming out, they went out into the wood and did just that. Things were a little bit more complicated with Rowena and Renwick and Bernard. First of all, when Renwick took his initiative, he said, "Well, you know what? The one person that I have not been able to ask about what might be causing this is Carlin, right? Ilana's husband." So Jason had Renwick bust into Carlin's room where Rowena was still. She had fallen asleep while caring for him in the night. When he busts in, Rowena wakes up and he starts kind of like going over and inspecting Carlin, and he confirms based on what yes, indeed he has that same infernal kind of poison disease. He had just arrived at kind of like the classification specific test that would allow him to determine. So he does that with him. He's like, I've got to talk to the wife. So he goes downstairs and Rowena follows him. She's like, you could mind your manners, right? Like, I appreciate that you're trying to do this, but you could mind your manners. We don't have time for manners, all of that. He goes down. He starts basically, as Ilana is trying to package food and send it out with the people. He comes in and he just kind of interrupts and starts just asking these very blunt questions. And it's not that he was asking anything bad or something that she wouldn't have wanted to necessarily engage with, but it was the way he was doing it. So I rolled a reaction roll to see how she would respond to his approach. I didn't modify it by anything other than his low charisma. He has a -1 to the roll, and she rolled hostile. It was a hostile result. Right now, she wasn't going to pick up a kitchen knife and attack him or anything like that. But what we took that to mean, it was basically she was kind of overwhelmed by the emotion of what was happening. She was in a public space and she blurted out something mean, right? And Alana's not a mean person, so blurted out something that was she kind of lost her composure, um, and blurted out something that was minimally insulting, but for her it was kind of like a big transgression of the way that she normally acts in front of people. And then she turned around, and she left, and she went to the kitchen. And then Rowena and kind of went at Renwick over this. "Oh, what are you doing?" And then he said something about, "We don't have the time for the emotions of women." And then she's like, "What? Now, on top of it all, you're going to be, impugning women." And they started getting into it. And Bernard at that point slipped into the kitchen with Alana and was like, "Listen, and then he tried to talk to her. Now, he has an 18 charisma, right? So he was able to affirm her feelings, apologize for Renwick, but then kind of build up Renwick as saying, like, Look, I know he shouldn't have said what he said or come at you the way that he did, and kind of affirm Renwick's, like, good traits, right? And saying, look, and this might help your husband and stuff." So he kind of smoothed over the situation and rolled a reaction roll for her and Bernard. It was the best of results. And so brought them in, and that allowed Renwick to ask some questions with help from the other two in terms of like how to phrase them. And he was actually able to provide a piece that Renwick had not been able to get, and Rowena had not been able to get from any of the other people. And that's it. You know, Carlin had taken a just a short jaunt from the village a few days before he became ill, and he ran into a merchant out on the road and exchanged something. They had like a trade, right? He exchanged something for something, and he was given like some spirits or something like that, some drink, and and he mentioned that, right, to her, and she passed it along to them. Now, yeah, and what Alana was also able to tell him is that Carlin had said that the merchant had said that he had picked up these spirits from a kindly old woman that he'd met on the side of the road not long before this trade occurred. So then they started thinking about this kindly old woman and who she might be, and what she might know, and all of that. So they kind of had, at that point, they determined that they would go out and ask around to see if anybody had seen this woman, right? So the three of them then went out to the wood. Okay, so then there was like another round of actions, and for Ursula's round of actions, I explained to her that she was out there with the lumberers, and she was with a group. She could see there were three groups of lumberers. She was with one group. She could see another group kind of adjacent to her at a distance, and then the third group was kind of out of her line of sight. And I rolled randomly to see where this encounter would occur. It was an encounter I decided would occur. I didn't roll; it was not a random encounter, but I rolled randomly to see where it would occur, and it happened in the encounter that was in the spot that was adjacent to where Ursula was. So she saw, as the men were working, this kindly old woman introduce herself to the pier, kind of on the margins of where people were working, with like a little bag, and stuff, and eventually somebody came over and talked to her, and she talks back, and then you can see that she's produces something from her bag, and like presses it into the man's hand, and he takes it and probably gives her like some copper or something for it and whatnot. And then the woman sits around for a little while just watching, and then eventually she kind of like ambles off, and the man goes back to work, and then a little later on he takes a swig from the gourd, offers it to another man. His friend rejects it, whatever he's drinking from the gourd and whatnot. And Ursula is like, yeah, okay, whatever. You know, didn't really respond to it, just took it in and went about her business. She has no reason to be suspicious of anything, right? So whatever, that occurred. In the meantime, I had Asher and Kraith, while they're out there hunting, I made a random encounter roll, and I produced from the tables in the book. I produced a bear, but I got it at far, um it was at a far distance. And so I decided that they didn't see the bear directly at first. They found the bear spoor, and they could tell that it was nearby. It was a very recent, like like stool that they found, for example, for the bear. And so I let them make a decision about what they wanted to do about that. And they decided they wanted to avoid the bear. I mean, they could have gone hunting for it, right? But they decided that they wanted to avoid the bear, so they instructed the hunters um, to get him out of there. That prompted me to make a roll for the hunters to see how well they did, and they rolled really, really well. So I'm like, all right, you guys avoided the encounter, and I had also rolled for the bear's attitude, so it wasn't like particularly hostile. So it may have seen them; they didn't see it directly, but it didn't mess with them, and they didn't mess with it. So they were coming back. It was on their way back that they ran into Renwick and Rowena and Bernard, who had gone out to the road, and kind of like moving, whatever. These guys came out from the forest onto the road, ran into Rowena and Bernard and Renwick, as they were kind of looking for signs of this old woman. They asked questions about the old woman. They didn't know anything. So then they all kind of proceeded back towards Wardenwood, and in doing so, they passed through the lumbering camp, which was just at a different angle from Wardenwood, which is why these three hadn't run into that first. But they passed through the 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 lumbering camp, and when they started to ask questions about the old woman, at which point Ursula says, "Well, I saw an old woman just a moment ago," and then they noticed that the man who had drunk from the gourd wasn't feeling well. So they're like, "Uh oh." So at that point, they're like, "Look," to the hunters. He said, "Look, you guys go back to the village, get the lumbers back to the village, go and care for this man. He may be deathly ill, with the same thing that the other people have. So we're going to go and investigate, and we'll be back." Right. So at that point, the all the player characters are gathered together, and they decided to press on to see if they can find this old woman. Now, Wardenwood, if I'm going to ping on Wardenwood here on the map, right? Again, and essentially what they were doing is that they were exploring this hex that I'm pinging here. And this is what they told me they wanted to go. They wanted to continue to just explore this whole hex. So they did. That means that there are these woods that are right next to Wardenwood, which is what they're spending most of the time. And by the way, one thing about this map, the map is made so that every hex is 2 miles, but the standard hex in ShadowDark is 6 miles. And I saw a point somewhere where Kelsey was kind of like, "Uh oh, next time I'm doing 6 mile hexes from now on because of that discrepancy between this map and the way the rules work." And I just said, "Screw it! Like I'm just gonna make these 6 mile hexes. I don't care if things don't make sense as a consequence." But I don't want to be converting stuff in my mind as to how it works. I'm just like, these are 6 mile hexes, whatever. We'll deal with the scale issues later. So, but anyway, so they're exploring this hex here. So I'm like, all right, you guys have enough time. You've already explored some of it over the course of what we did that morning, but I'm like, you guys have enough time to explore this hex and get back to Wardenwood before the gates shut. Is that what you want to do? You don't have to camp out in the wood, in other words. They're like, yeah, that's what we want to do. So I rolled a random encounter, and I got another random encounter. And what the random encounter they got was bandits, and it's 3d6 bandits. I rolled like a 15 on the die, so it's a lot of bandits. It might have been a 17 on the die that I rolled. It's a lot of bandits, right? I'm like, ooh, this could go bad. And then I rolled to see what activity the bandits were doing. It's like they were having a meal. I'm like, all right. So the way I staged this was that there were like 17 bandits, but I rolled a d6 to see how many of them would be sentry around where they had made a temporary camp to have a meal. And so the player characters are going to run into the sentries first, right? Now, also, I knew which bandits these were because there are bandits in the setting that are doing something very specific. And I'm like, these bandits have to be associated with that. So that's cool because just by through random encounter rolls and players poking around, kind of researching something that's happening, a situation that's happening in town, they're suddenly running across something that doesn't have anything to do with that, but has something to do with something else. And of course, the players don't know they're not related activities, but or circumstances or situations or players, but it's just kind of emerging from play, right? So anyway, we'll get to more on those bandits and who they are later. But for this moment, the players are moving through the wood. They come out to a clearing. They hear some. Well, actually, they don't hear voices in the distance. They come out into a little clearing, and of these sentries triangulate on their point and come out of the wood like with short bows pointed at them, right? Arrows knocked, pointed at them. And there's this kind of tense moment. And then they start kind of like parlaying a little bit. Questions are asked. Rowena basically asks, like, "What are you doing on my forest?" And the bandits kind of look at each other and they're like, "What do you mean your forest? Like we're the ones that are here. We live in the forest. Whatever." He said something like, "I don't know what you're talking about, dearie, but this is like our." She's like, "Oh yeah." So when Rowena is impulsive, apparently doesn't, which is right, doesn't like sexism. She felt like she'd already been talked down to by Renwick earlier in terms of like, that, and now these bandits are doing it. So she casts eye bite on the lead bandit who's like, whatever, and then combat ensues. So we roll initiative. The bandits go. Arrows are fired. Rowena is hit by an arrow, but she doesn't drop. Um, and then combat ensues, and it very quickly goes south for the bandits. Right, like Asher, Craith, Ursula, Bernard, they all charge in and attack. The first one in was Bernard, and Dan wasn't fooling around. He had Bernard activate his demonic possession power, which means his eyes flashed red, and he moved over. And Renwick, the wizard, noticed that. Jason is such a crafty and attentive player. He's like, because I, I asked, I think I asked what he was doing on his action. He basically said observing, and so I had to make a roll, and I shared the bandits. When you see Bernard's eyes go red as he attacks the lead bandit gets a look of like surprise that the red eyes happen, but then like recognition. I said there's like a look of like understanding in his eyes when he sees that, and then Bernard cut him down, right? So whatever that bandit saw, we'll never know because Bernard instantly killed him. Um, but Jason was like, that interaction meant something, right? So he filed that away. Asher, Craith, Ursula go in and immediately wipe out the other guards, the other sentries. There's uh, no chance. They're just down. But that made a lot of noise, and so then the heroes hear at a distance in the wood beyond the clearing that they're in. There's like a cry of alarm, and like they can hear a lot of people kind of like reacting to the noise that they just made. And so they decided to book. They didn't know how many people there. They just ran. And so now they're being chased by like 12, 13, 14 bandits, whatever it was. And Ursula, Mike said, I'm going to have Ursula try to, as a ranger, try to lead the players kind of on a side direction and hide our tracks to see if we can just avoid this group. And she was successful, and they were unsuccessful in terms of their, perception rule. So they were hidden as the group of bandits like ran off in a different direction. And Renwick then went to Bernard and he's like, okay, what are you? You're not a regular knight. What are you? And why did that bandit react the way that he did? And Bernard was like, we can discuss those sorts of things when we get back to the village. And there was some debate. Renwick was like, we should go back to their camp. They just ran off looking for us. We should go back to their camp and see if there's anything there. Maybe there's a clue. And they're like, no, we're going back to the village. If we go and mess around with the camp now, we might get caught. And besides, we need to get back to the village before the gates close. So Renwick was kind of outvoted. I think Rowena was kind of like, I'm with you, Renwick, but everybody else is kind of like walking away, like, no, this is not the great idea. Or maybe it was Ursula. I don't know. But maybe it wasn't Rowena because she was injured. It might have been Ursula who was kind of like standing around, like, I don't really care. But when most of the other people are like, we're going back to the village, Ursula looks at Renwick and kind of like, and goes after them. And then Renwick's like, fine. So they all head back to the village. And that's where we ended session one. So I will be back soon to tell you what happened in session two. But before I do that, before I wrap this up, I'd like to say that I've made a little bit of a tweak to the experience rules. If you look at the rules as written, it's really strongly leans towards the idea that the way you get experience points in ShadowDark is by acquiring treasure. Um, there's a little bit of wiggly language there that suggests that you can give experience points for other accomplishments, but they're not, or other experiences, maybe, but those guidelines aren't as clearly manifested as the or expressed as the rules about experience points for treasure. And I'm okay with that in many circumstances, but I don't want this to be primarily a dungeon delver, and I'm not sure how much experience is gonna how treasure is gonna be lying around for them to earn experience from. So I decided I created a kind of a fast and loose way of assigning experience points for certain types of combat encounters and certain types of discoveries and certain types of social interactions, depending on their magnitude and what's at stake and how successful they are. So I handed out some experience points, even though they didn't bring back any treasure from this. Not enough to get them to second level, but some experience points were had, and uh, and then we wrapped up for the night. So a very it felt like a very successful session. Um, I felt like the play was emergent. I don't feel like I of all the decisions that I made, there was only one that was sort of scripted, and it wasn't scripted so much. It was just something that I decided for sure was going to happen. I didn't know how it would go. But that was the really, I guess, two. One, that the old woman would try to come into Wardenwood, and two, that that night, and two, failing that the old woman would go to the lumberers encampment. Those are two things I decided that I would do. And the last thing I'll say is that that was the big modification that I had to make, and that's that for this situation, as it's set up, the kindly old woman whose name is Drusilla is very much enmeshed with what's already going on at Wardenwood. There's somebody in Wardenwood who believes that the old woman is a good healer, and Drusilla is de facto the healer of Wardenwood in the way that it's written in here. What I did here is that I kept the basic situation, took out the woman who's kind of like her sponsor, right? And relegated Drusilla to being an outside force that is trying to come in. And part of coming in is making it difficult for Wardenwood's actual healer, contemporary healer. So, which is of course Rowena, right? So a minor tweak, but a significant one, I think, in terms of how that whole situation rolls out. And it's worked out really, really well so far. So I'll tell you what happens in session 2 next time. In the meantime, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying to the end. As always, I wish you good health. I wish you good cheer. I wish you good gaming. Goodbye.